The gradient here is irrelevant. The rails are cast iron plate, set into stone blocks on a tramway, built for horse-drawn wagons, hauling iron from a South Wales ironworks. The date is the 21st of February, 1804, and the machine moving along them, slowly, purposefully, exhaust venting to the atmosphere with a rhythmic percussion that no one present has ever heard before, weighs 5 tons and runs on steam at 40 pounds per square inch. 40 pounds per square inch. Every serious engineer of the era, every man trained in the orthodoxy of Boulton and Watt, would have told you that was not merely inadvisable. It was lethal. It was the engineering equivalent of filling a cast-iron vessel with controlled violence and attaching it to a frame on wheels, behind the locomotive, 10 tons of iron in 5 wagons. 70 men riding on top of the load, 9 miles to the canal wharf at Abercynon. The locomotive made it. The engineer who built it was a 32-year-old Cornishman named Richard Trevithick, and this was not the first time his engine had been called impossible. It would not be the last. What Trevithick built at Penydarren in the winter of 1803 was not just the world's first working steam railway locomotive. It was the demonstration of a principle that the most powerful engineer in Britain had spent 3 decades trying to prevent: high-pressure steam. The engineering establishment called it dangerous. The courts tried to stop it. Parliament was lobbied to ban it. Across 4 continents, in the years that followed, the engine that changed the world would be resisted, suppressed, confiscated, and written out of the record. It still changed the world, but almost nobody who knows that fact knows whose engine it was. To understand why Trevithick's engine was treated as a threat rather than a triumph, you have to understand what stood in its way. James Watt's low-pressure condensing engine had dominated British industrial power since the 1770s. Through his business partnership with Matthew Boulton, Watt had done something extraordinary. He had not only built a better steam engine than the Newcomen atmospheric type, he had also patented it in terms broad enough to cover almost any improvement a competitor might attempt. And then, in 1775, he had secured an Act of Parliament extending that patent until the year 1800. 25 years of legal monopoly over the prime mover of the Industrial Revolution. The royalties Boulton and Watt collected, typically 1/3 of the fuel savings a customer achieved over the older Newcomen engine, were the commercial engine of their firm, and so anything that threatened the business model was, by necessity, also a danger to the public. That was the argument. High-pressure steam was volatile, ungovernable, catastrophic in failure. Watt himself said that engineers who pursued it deserved hanging. But the engineering case was not the real case. Boulton and Watt's alarmist position on high-pressure steam, as engineering historians have since documented, was substantially driven by the fact that high-pressure engines would fall entirely outside their patent control. A non-condensing high-pressure engine, venting its steam to atmosphere, infringed nothing Watt had registered. It was beyond his legal reach. And that was the threat he could not name publicly. Trevithick was served with a court injunction in 1796 for other alleged patent infringements connected to his early work with the engineer Edward Bull. He navigated the legal landscape carefully. He did not patent his high-pressure engine design when he finally demonstrated it, deliberately, so that other engineers could use it without obstruction. That decision alone sets the moral and engineering record straight about who, between Trevithick and Watt, actually wanted the technology to advance. Before we continue, if this kind of railway history matters to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Every video here is built around the locomotives and railway systems that the standard histories overlooked. The machines that outperformed their celebrated counterparts. The engineering decisions that were ahead of their time, and the railway lines that shaped nations without receiving the recognition they deserved. If that is the kind of documentary worth watching to you, the subscribe button is how you tell us, and we want to hear from you. Did you work on the railways? As a driver, a fireman, a fitter, a signalman, a track engineer? Did a parent or grandparent spend their career on a railway that is no longer operating, on a locomotive class that is no longer preserved, or in a workshop that is no longer standing? Leave it in the comments. The people who actually operated these machines know things that do not appear in any published railway history. We want to hear from them. Now, back to the locomotive. The engineering argument Trevithick was making was precise, and the physics supported it entirely. Watt's condensing engine operated at pressures only marginally above atmospheric, typically 5 to 10 pounds per square inch. The condenser, which Watt had patented as his central innovation, cooled the spent steam back to water, creating a partial vacuum that pulled the piston rather than the pressure pushing it. It was elegant engineering. It was also heavy, large, and mechanically complex. Dependent on a separate condensing vessel, cooling water, and an air pump to maintain the vacuum, you could not put it on a locomotive. The physics would not permit it. The weight and the complexity were irreconcilable with the demands of transport. Trevithick understood something that Watt's conservatism had suppressed. If you built your boiler strong enough to contain steam at genuine pressure, 40, 60, 100 pounds per square inch and beyond, you did not need a condenser at all. The steam itself, expanding against the piston, provided the work. You vented it to atmosphere afterward, and built a smaller, lighter, entirely mobile engine. The Penydarren locomotive's boiler operated at approximately 40 pounds per square inch. By 1802, in experimental work at Coalbrookdale, Trevithick had already demonstrated steam at 145 pounds per square inch, 10 times atmospheric pressure, in a vessel that held. That was the engineering achievement Watt said would kill people. Trevithick's cylinder on the Penydarren engine was 8 inches in diameter. The stroke was 54 inches. A single large flywheel carried the engine through its dead centers. The exhaust steam, rather than being condensed, was directed up the chimney, a detail that would later be identified as the blast pipe, drawing air through the fire and dramatically improving combustion. George Stephenson would later build his reputation partly on this principle. He did not invent it. The locomotive made its historic run on the 21st of February, 1804. It hauled 10 tons of iron and 70 men over 9 miles of tramway. It ran the return journey with empty wagons. It proved, against the weight of professional opinion, that steam could move itself. It then broke the cast iron plate rails, which were not designed for 5 tons of concentrated axle load. Trevithick acknowledged this was a problem for the track, not the engine. He was correct. The suppression of Trevithick's engine did not end in the Welsh valleys. It moved with him and after him, across the world. In Britain, the legislative hostility would eventually crystallize, not in his lifetime, but in the decades after his death, into the Locomotives Act of 1865, known popularly as the Red Flag Act. This required any self-propelled steam vehicle on a public road to be preceded by a man walking 60 yards ahead, carrying a red flag by day and a red lantern by night. The speed limit on country roads was set at 4 miles per hour. In towns, 2 miles per hour. Parliament had made it effectively illegal to use steam traction to its actual capability on British roads. The railway interests, whose tracks were protected from road competition, had successfully lobbied for legislation that made road steam engines commercially useless. This was the engineering principle Trevithick had proved in 1801, when his puffing Devil Road locomotive had carried passengers up Cambourne Hill on Christmas Eve. Treated, 60 years later, as too powerful and too dangerous to be permitted, in North America, Oliver Evans had independently developed high-pressure steam engines in the United States from 1801 onward, working on the same principle as Trevithick, without knowledge of his Cornish counterpart. Evans faced his own version of the same hostility. His high-pressure engine was condemned as dangerous by the engineering and political establishment. The explosion of high-pressure boilers on American river steamboats, events that by mid-century had killed hundreds of people, provided the legislative momentum for increasingly strict federal regulation. The U.S. Congress's Steamboat Act of 1852 imposed a regime of inspection and engineering requirements that, while ultimately beneficial to safety, was also used to restrict and delegitimize the high-pressure technology that Evans had championed. In France, the story begins even earlier. Nicolas Joseph Cugnot had demonstrated a steam-powered road vehicle in 1769, before Trevithick's birth, using high-pressure principles. The vehicle, which still survives in the Musée des Arts et Métiers in Paris, was reportedly confiscated by the French authorities, and Cugnot's work was not continued. The state, not the market, had ended it. And in South America, in Peru specifically, Trevithick's own engines met a fate that closed the circuit on the suppression narrative with a particular finality. 9 Trevithick high-pressure engines were contracted in 1814 for installation at the silver mines of Cerro de Pasco, high in the Peruvian Andes at over 14,000 feet above sea level. Against what the engineers of the period considered scientifically improbable, the engines succeeded in draining the flooded lower levels of the mines at altitude. Silver production rose. The viceregal government received Trevithick himself, when he arrived in February 1817 to superintend the installation, with a guard of honor. Then the Peruvian War of Independence reached the mines. The fighting that followed the Battle of Cerro de Pasco in 1820 halted production entirely. The engines, left without maintenance in a war zone at extreme altitude, deteriorated. The last surviving engine broke down in December 1821. By the time peace was restored, the machinery was beyond recovery. 4 continents, 4 different mechanisms of suppression: legal, legislative, political, and military. The engine survived all of them. In 1808, Trevithick made his last attempt to bring the locomotive to public attention. He constructed a 4th locomotive, named, with a defiance that is still audible a century and a half later, "Catch Me Who Can," and laid a circular demonstration track on a field south of what is now Euston Square in London. Members of the public were invited to pay for rides in a carriage hauled by a steam locomotive, 1 shilling for a circuit of the track. The locomotive reached speeds of between 12 and 15 miles per hour on the curve, and Trevithick believed it capable of 20 miles per hour on straight track. It was the world's first fare-paying passenger railway. The locomotive weighed 8 tons and was built by John Hazeldine and John Urpeth Rastrick at the Hazeldine Foundry in Bridgnorth, Shropshire. The soft London ground and caused the track to sink. The rails broke under the weight. The demonstration lasted a matter of weeks before a derailment ended it. Trevithick's investors were not persuaded. The railway establishment was not interested. He moved on to other work: iron tanks, dredging engines, steam threshing machines, and in 1811 went bankrupt following the failure of a London business. He spent the years from 1816 to 1827 in Latin America, in Peru, then Colombia, working for Simón Bolívar. He returned to England in 1827 with no money, to find that in his 11-year absence, George Stephenson had opened the Stockton and Darlington Railway in 1825, and the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1830 was in preparation. The railway age had arrived. And it had arrived on the engineering principle that Trevithick had demonstrated and never patented 23 years before. Stephenson's locomotives operated on high-pressure, non-condensing steam. They used the blast pipe principle. The fundamental architecture of the steam locomotive, the one that would eventually produce the Union Pacific Big Boy, the Enora Gresley Pacifics, the South African Garrats, traced directly to Trevithick. Trevithick died on the 22nd of April 1833 at Dartford, Kent. He died with no money and was buried in an unmarked grave in St Edmund's churchyard. His fellow workers at a local engineering works paid the costs of his funeral. No railway company, no engineering institution, and no government department contributed anything. The man who made railways possible died in a pauper's grave. What the historical record shows, when you read it without the subsequent noise of Stephenson mythology and Victorian railway triumphalism, is this: the principle on which every steam locomotive ever built operated was demonstrated by a Cornish mine engineer in 1797. The first working steam railway locomotive was his. The first passenger-carrying steam railway was his. The blast pipe that made every subsequent locomotive draw its fire was his. The high-pressure non-condensing engine architecture that made locomotives mobile, compact, and powerful enough to do real work, his. He was suppressed by a patent monopolist in Britain. He was legislated against across Europe. He was opposed by commercial interests in the United States. His own engines in South America were consumed by a war he had no part in. He died poor. But the engineering principle did not die with him. It spread the moment Watt's patents expired, as his successor engineers had always known it would. The Cornish engine, the most fuel-efficient pumping engine in the world by the 1820s, ran on Trevithick's principles. The locomotive that won the Rainhill trials in 1829, Stephenson's rocket, used the blast pipe. The locomotives that hauled the coal and the cotton and the passengers across the world for the next 150 years used the high-pressure non-condensing architecture, every one of them. The engine was not banned for being too powerful. It was resisted by those who had something to lose from it. That is the engineering record. It does not change. If this is the kind of railway history you want to keep watching, subscribe to the channel. There are more locomotives, more railway systems, and more engineering achievements still to document. And if you have a connection to what you just watched, a family member who worked with early steam technology, who operated on a railway whose heritage traces to these first principles, or who has direct knowledge of the Cornish engineering tradition that Trevithick founded, tell us in the comments. What did they drive? Which railway? Which depot? Which line? The people who operated these machines are not in the standard histories, but the engineering record depends on what they remember. We want to hear from them.